This is Andrew Hockensmith, a 9-year-old boy who until recently lived a peaceful and joyful life with his family in Danville, Kentucky. His parents, Michael and Angie, owned a local pawn shop, and recently the family had grown with the arrival of a new member, little Naomi, just 13 months old. Andrew was thrilled at the idea of being the older brother. He adored his little sister. Caring for her and seeing her smile was one of the things that made him the happiest. Life seemed perfect. The pawn shop, the close-knit family, and the sunny mornings in Danville gave a sense that nothing could go wrong. But on September 20th, 2013, that peace was brutally interrupted. What began as an ordinary morning, with Andrew playing in the shop while his parents worked, soon turned into a nightmare he would never forget. If this content has captivated you and you want more stories like this, don't forget to like the video. Your like makes all the difference and helps bring more amazing content to you. Shall we go together? Before we get to the fateful day, it's important to understand how the Hockensmiths' lives reached that point. Michael and Angie were a couple made for each other. They met when they were young, and it was love at first sight. Angie was a charismatic woman, always with a smile on her face, and Michael, a man of faith, dedicated his life to helping others. They shared a strong belief in God and were deeply involved in their local church. Michael worked as a youth pastor, guiding the community's teenagers on their spiritual journey. He was beloved by all, and his faith was the pillar that supported his family. However, being a youth pastor was not enough to financially support the family, especially with Naomi's arrival. The salary was modest, and Michael knew he needed another source of income to secure his children's future. That's when an unexpected opportunity arose. Alan Keith was a respected figure in the community. He was also a pastor, and his sermons were known for inspiring and deeply touching people's hearts. But Keith was a multifaceted man. In addition to preaching the Word of God, he also owned several pawn shops. This might seem strange to some, as pastors and pawn shops don't typically go hand in hand, but Keith managed to balance these two worlds in a unique way. He bought and sold precious metals, videos, CDs, and other valuable items, and his life was a blend of the Bible and gold. Michael admired Alan Keith. To him, Keith was more than a friend. He was a mentor, someone he trusted deeply. Young Andrew saw Pastor Keith as an almost family figure, like an uncle. So, when Keith offered Michael the chance to work at one of his pawn shops, ABC Gold Games and more, Michael saw it as a blessing. It was the opportunity to secure a better life for his family without neglecting his mission as a pastor. The new routine of the Hockensmiths. With a new job at the pawn shop, things began to improve for the Hockensmiths. Michael now had a stable source of income, and the family was closer than ever. Angie and Michael decided that, to strengthen these bonds even further, they would homeschool Andrew. This way, they could spend the whole day together, even while working. The pawn shop became the center of the family's life. For Andrew, the shop was a magical place. Filled with games, movies, toys, and all kinds of knickknacks, he saw it as a true amusement park. Every corner of the shop hid something new and interesting to discover. He spent hours exploring while his parents took care of business. Little Naomi would either be in her mother's lap or sleeping in the stroller, while Andrew ran around, imagining stories and adventures with the items he found. He loved being there. The pawn shop was more than just a workplace for his parents. It was like an extension of their home, a space where he felt safe and happy. Life seemed perfect, and the days passed peacefully, until that September morning when everything changed. The day of the robbery. On the morning of September 20th, 2013, Andrew was at the shop as usual. His parents were busy with customers, and he, as always, found ways to entertain himself. Naomi, still very small, was in her stroller, sleeping peacefully. Everything seemed normal until suddenly, the sound of gunfire echoed through the store. Andrew froze. What was happening? He heard screams and, in an instant, knew that something terrible was going on. His heart raced, and fear consumed his body. He knew he had to protect his sister. Quickly, he hid with Naomi, trying to stay calm. But what could a 9-year-old boy do in such a frightening situation? With trembling hands, Andrew picked up the phone and called 911, the emergency number. The voice of the operator on the other end was calm and reassuring, but Andrew was terrified. He told them that a robbery was in progress at the pawn shop. As he spoke, the operator heard something that made his heart sink even more. the cries of a baby. It was Naomi, who was also in danger. Andrew knew that any noise could reveal where they were hiding. He tried to calm his little sister while the operator kept the line open, trying to gather as much information as possible. The police were dispatched immediately to the scene. The arrival of the police. In just 6 minutes, the police arrived at the shop. Knowing the situation was urgent, they tried to open the front door, but it was locked. Without wasting time, they broke the glass and entered the premises. What they found inside was horrifying. There was a large pool of blood on the floor, and 3 bodies lay fallen. The silence in the shop was disturbing. The officers didn't know if the shooter was still there, but they knew they needed to find Andrew and Naomi. Guided by the information from the 911 operator, the police began to search the shop. They finally found the 2 children, still hiding. Andrew was holding Naomi, trying to protect her from everything that was happening. Both were terrified but physically unharmed. The children were taken to the police station, still in shock from what they had just experienced. Meanwhile, in the pawn shop, the police and detectives began examining the crime scene. The forensic scientist analyzed the bodies while the investigators tried to understand what had happened and who was responsible for the tragedy. If you want more revealing content like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. This way, you'll stay informed and help spread the truth. Click the subscribe button and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any new videos. Life would never be the same again. What should have been just another ordinary day in the Hockensmith family's life turned into a tragedy that changed their lives forever. Andrew, who until then had lived a happy and carefree childhood, now carried the weight of having witnessed his family's destruction before his eyes. He had been brave, protecting his sister and calling 911, but nothing could prepare him for the pain that would come afterward. The pawn shop, which had once been a place of joy and fun for him, had now become the setting for his worst nightmares. It was a very difficult scene to comprehend. The Hockensmith shop sold guns and ammunition, which made it complicated to know what was a clue and what was just part of the inventory. Right at the entrance, there was the body of a woman lying near the register. On the other side of the counter was the body of a man. Following a trail of blood, they found the 3rd victim, another man, lying face down at the back of the store. One of the bodies appeared to have been moved to a spot where, if someone looked through the front door, they wouldn't be able to see it. The victims had been shot multiple times, and it seemed that the shooting continued even after they were already on the ground. What the investigators had managed to discover up to that point was that the shell casings on the floor were from a .22 caliber weapon. As the police investigated, Andrew's grandmothers, Charlene and Barbara, arrived at the shop in a panic. They wanted to know if their family was okay, but as they got closer, they saw the police tape surrounding the area and numerous police cars parked outside. Their hearts raced. They tried to approach, but the officers stopped them from going any further. "You can't go in," the police said. At that moment, Charlene broke down. Deep down, she knew something terrible had happened. Her heart shattered. "I couldn't understand why. What had they done so wrong to deserve this? Who in their right mind would want to hurt them?" she thought, unable to accept what was happening. Soon, the police identified the first 2 victims, Michael and Angie Hockensmith, the owners of the shop and parents of Andrew and Naomi. The 3rd victim was Dan Smith, a 60-year-old customer who used to buy and sell gold with the Hockensmiths. He was a regular at the shop. At first glance, it seemed like it had all been a robbery gone wrong. After all, the pawn shop was a common target for thieves due to its valuable items. But there was something that didn't add up. Dan Smith's suitcase was open on the counter, still full of cash. Additionally, the cash register was also intact, containing over $1,000. If it was a robbery, why hadn't the thief taken the money before fleeing? The detectives began to suspect that the crime was not a simple robbery. Mike and Dan's wallets weren't taken either, noted one of the investigators. This made them think that the victims might have been killed for another reason. But what could that reason be? The investigation became even more complicated. If it wasn't a robbery, what happened there? Could one of the victims have been the real target? The detectives began to wonder, was Dan Smith the target? Dan Smith was known for being a gold buyer. He always carried a briefcase full of cash when he visited the pawn shops in the area. Dan's wife told the police that he followed a specific route on certain days of the week. He would stop by the bank, pick up the money, and then visit several pawn shops to buy gold. On the day of the crime, Dan had visited a jewelry store called Lawson's Jewelers in Harrodsburg, just 19 minutes from the Hockensmith shop. He entered the store with his briefcase, chatted with the clerk, and seemed relaxed, even laughing. He had no idea what was about to happen. Less than an hour later, he would be dead. The detectives reviewed the security footage from the jewelry store, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. There was no one suspicious watching Dan or following him. "We really ran out of answers at that point," said one of the investigators. Who was the real target? The hypothesis that Dan Smith was the main target led nowhere. The detectives were without leads, suspects, or answers. The killer was still on the loose, and the victims' families were in mourning. News of the murders quickly spread throughout Danville and neighboring towns, shocking the entire community. The pawn shop, which had once been a place of work and peaceful interaction, was now the scene of a dark and unsolved mystery. Something terrible had happened in Danville, a small and quiet town. 2 children were left without parents after they were murdered inside their family's pawn shop, located just a few blocks from Center College. The tragedy was even more shocking because one of the children, Andrew, had to call 911 and protect his little sister, Naomi, from the violence that was unfolding. The entire town is in shock, searching for answers. Even Pastor Alan Keith, who had helped the Hockensmiths get into the pawn business, was devastated. He wrote on social media, "I can't even sleep. I'm in shock over the loss of these 3 great people. I also knew the third man. He was a customer and a good friend." The police discovered that the suspect fled through the back door of the shop and then disappeared into the alley. They are desperate for information, as the killer is still on the loose, and so far, they have no clear motive or specific suspect. Andrew, the boy who called 911, may be in danger, but no one knows why. For now, he and his sister are being protected by the police and will soon be with their grandparents. The entire town is perplexed. Who could want to do something so horrible? The police continue investigating, trying to understand what happened, when suddenly a new lead emerges. Someone mentions the name Kenneth Allen Keith. Pastor Keith, the same one who helped the Hockensmiths in the past, now becomes part of the investigation. The police find out that Kenneth Allen Keith owned a pawn shop in Somerset, Kentucky, and was also the pastor of a church in Pulaski County. He was well liked by his congregation and seemed to be a good and trustworthy person. But something was off. A friend of Keith's mentioned that he had made suspicious comments about the case. When the investigators called Keith, the conversation became even stranger. He was in Danville on the day of the murder, even though he lived about 50 minutes away. Keith said he went there to pick up medicine for his wife at a pharmacy where he wasn't even a regular customer. He provided a detailed account of all his movements that day, but the detectives began to dig deeper. Soon, they uncovered something important. Keith had once owned the Hockensmiths pawn shop, but due to financial troubles, he had to sell the shop to Mike and Angie. Keith felt betrayed, believing that the shop should still belong to him and that the Hockensmiths had stolen it from him. The motive for the crime was starting to become clear. But there was a problem. At the time of the murder, Keith claimed to be buying medicine for his wife. If this alibi was confirmed by the pharmacy's cameras, he could be ruled out as a suspect. Now, the police needed to find out if he was telling the truth or if there was something more behind this story. That morning, the investigators rushed to obtain the recordings from the pharmacy where Pastor Alan Keith said he had gone to pick up medicine for his wife. If he had indeed been there at the time of the crime, it would prove that he could not be the murderer. When the police reviewed the footage, they saw Keith on the security cameras at 9:24 a.m., just 8 minutes after the time of the murders. This made it impossible for him to be in both places at the same time. It seemed that his alibi would clear him of any suspicion, and the investigation could lose its direction. But there was one person who could help clarify everything. Andrew, the 9-year-old boy who survived the attack and called 911. If Andrew could remember something that proved Pastor Keith was at the shop that day, the police would finally have an answer. The day of the crime. It was September 20th, and everything started as a normal day. The Hockensmiths arrived at the pawn shop and opened it around 9 a.m. Andrew, as always, went to his favorite corner, where he began playing one of the new games in the shop while his parents prepared the place for the workday. Shortly after, a customer entered. It was Dan Smith, known as the Gold Man, a regular at the shop. While Andrew's father chatted with Dan, his mother, Angie, was taking care of little Naomi near the register. Everything seemed calm and routine. Andrew, distracted by his game, wasn't paying much attention to what was happening around him. He was used to this kind of activity in the shop. Imagine yourself in little Andrew's place, trying to protect your sister amid the chaos. How would you feel? Share in the comments how this story touched you and what you would do in such a desperate situation. We look forward to hearing your thoughts. The arrival of danger. But then, something strange happened. A man entered the shop, and Andrew noticed that he looked odd. The boy felt a chill run down his spine, but he had no idea what was coming next. Suddenly, the man pulled out a gun and shouted, "Get down on the floor!" Everyone froze in fear and obeyed. Andrew, his mother, and his sister huddled in a corner, trying not to be seen. The intruder began to shoot. Andrew, still very young, did not immediately understand what was happening. To him, the sound sounded like dart shots, like in toys. But in reality, the man fired 8 times. Andrew watched in horror as his father tried to negotiate with the shooter. "Please, stop." But Andrew's father couldn't escape. He rolled over and came to a stop, motionless on the floor. Angie's sacrifice. The shooter then turned to Dan, the customer, and it was at that moment that Angie realized what was about to happen. She knew her family would be next. In one last act of courage, Angie turned to Andrew and Naomi and told them to hide. "My mom told me to go to the back with my sister," Andrew recalled. He crawled to the back office of the shop, carrying Naomi in his arms. He placed her on the couch and sat beside her, trying not to make a sound. From their hiding place, Andrew heard 4 more gunshots, followed by a deathly silence. Andrew's courage. After a few seconds of silence, Andrew knew he had to check what had happened. He crawled to the door and, with his heart racing, looked outside. There was his mother, lying on the floor, surrounded by a pool of blood. Devastated, he returned to the office, knowing that he and his sister were now the only ones left. At that moment, the only thing that mattered to Andrew was protecting Naomi. He ran to the office phone and dialed 911, hoping help would arrive before the dangerous man discovered where they were hiding. A 9-year-old boy called 911 to report that his family had been killed. But what he did before that is heartbreaking. With great courage, Andrew took his little sister, who was only 14 months old, and brought her to the pawn shop's office. He hid her and lay on top of her, trying to protect her with his own body. Thanks to his bravery and quick thinking, he and his little sister emerged physically unscathed from that terrible day. Because of Andrew's detailed recollection of what happened, the police began to realize that Pastor Keith's alibi, the main suspect, was not as solid as it seemed. Suddenly, all the clues started to fit together. Pastor Keith had a silver minivan, and a security camera had recorded a vehicle matching his passing by the pawn shop shortly before and right after the shooting. This, along with Andrew's 911 call, indicated that it was possible for Keith to have gone to both the shop and the pharmacy within the same time frame. Without this information, Keith might have escaped with his alibi. But the police pieced everything together, and on October 9, 2013, 19 days after the murders, they finally had enough evidence to arrest him. They obtained search warrants for his home, his church, and his pawn shop in Somerset. An investigator entered Keith's shop pretending to be a customer, and there they found a box for a device that could be turned into a silencer. This confirmed the suspicion that a silencer was used in the murders, which explained the strange sound Andrew described when his parents were shot. Additionally, outside the shop, the police found bullet casings and a target that had been used for shooting practice. The bullet casings matched exactly with those found at the crime scene. Finally, Pastor Keith was arrested in his own pawn shop without resistance. The families of the Hockensmiths and Dan Smith felt relieved. The man they once called a friend was behind bars. He had betrayed everything they represented, but justice was finally served. However, one thing still shocked everyone. How could someone commit murders on a Friday and then stand to the pulpit to preach on Sunday, especially in front of 2 children who had lost their parents? This made everyone think he wasn't a real pastor. To prevent Andrew and his family from going through a long and painful trial, the prosecution offered Keith a plea deal to avoid the death penalty. Meanwhile, Andrew found a way to express his pain. He started drawing and creating comics. Despite having gone through unimaginable trauma, Andrew managed to save his sister and call for help. His parents had always taught him to be strong and brave, and that day, he showed just how much he resembled them. "My dad made everything seem so easy. He was really an amazing person." Even with the tragic end of his parents, they managed to protect what was most important to them, their children. On May 26, 2017, Andrew woke up with a mix of emotions. It was his 13th birthday, a significant milestone in any young person's life, but for him, that day carried a much heavier weight. It wasn't just the day he officially became a teenager. It was also the day Pastor Keith, the man responsible for the tragedy that had devastated his family, would finally face justice. Andrew remembered every detail of that morning. The sky was clear, and the sun was shining, but inside him, he felt a storm of emotions. While his loving family surrounded him, trying to make his birthday special, he knew that the most anticipated moment of the day would not be the cake or the presents, but the sentencing of the man who had destroyed his childhood. The courtroom was packed. Andrew, sitting next to his sister Naomi and other family members, watched in silence as the judge read the sentence. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. Pastor Keith, who had once been seen as a family friend, was now condemned to spend the rest of his days behind bars. His greed and jealousy, which had led him to commit such horrible acts, would never hurt anyone again. When the sentence was announced, Andrew felt a weight lift off his shoulders. It wasn't a feeling of joy, but of relief. He knew that although nothing could bring his parents back, justice had been served, and that, in a way, gave him a sense of peace. Back home, the atmosphere was different. There was a lightness in the air, a feeling that they could finally move on. Naomi, now a teenager, had a shy smile on her face. She looked so much like their mother that sometimes Andrew found himself looking at her and feeling a pang of nostalgia. But that nostalgia wasn't bitter. It was sweet, filled with good memories. Today, Andrew is surrounded by a family that loves him deeply. He has grown strong and resilient, and despite everything he has been through, he has found joy again. Recently, he got engaged, an important step in his life. Next to his fiancée, he feels that he is building the life his parents always wanted for him. Even though his parents are no longer physically present, Andrew knows that they are always with him. People around him often comment, "You look just like your dad. You resemble him. You act like him." And Andrew takes pride in that. He remembers how strong, fair, and always right his father was, even in the most difficult situations. Naomi, with her bright eyes and gentle smile, is the living image of their mother. She inherited their mother's sweetness and calmness, and Andrew feels grateful to have such a strong connection with her. "My parents will always live inside me," he often says, and that is how he chooses to move forward. He carries with him the lessons, love, and strength he learned from them, guiding him in every decision and every step he takes. In the most challenging moments, when painful memories threaten to resurface, Andrew finds comfort in happy memories. He remembers the laughter, the hugs, and the unconditional support he always received from his parents. And now, as he builds his own family, he knows he is honoring their legacy. Andrew's life has not been easy, but he is living proof that even in the face of great pain, it is possible to find the strength to carry on. He has learned that the love of his parents did not disappear with the tragedy. It lives on in every gesture, in every smile, and in every memory he holds in his heart. And so, their love remains present, guiding him in every step he takes.